While visiting a famous grocery between Wendell and Isola, he ran into Betty Bliss, asked her, and she said she still remembered Turgenev's prose poem about roses with its refrain, "Kak horoshi, kak zvezi," how fair, how fresh, and would certainly be delighted to come. He asked the celebrated mathematician, Professor Idelson, and his wife, a sculptress, and they say they would come with joy, but later telephoned to say they were tremendously sorry they had overlooked a previous engagement. He asked young Miller, who by now an associate professor, and Charlotte, his pretty freckled wife, but it turned out she was on the point of having a baby. He asked old Carroll, the Freeze Hall head janitor, with his son Frank, who had been my friend's only talented student and had written a brilliant doctor's thesis for him on the relationship between Russian, English, and German iambics, but Frank was in the army, and old Carroll confessed that the missus and I don't mix much with the profs. He rang up the residence of President Poor, whom he had once talked to about improving the curriculum at a lawn function until it started to rain, and asked him to come. President Poor's niece answered that her uncle nowadays never visits with anybody except a few personal friends. He was about to give up the notion of enlivening his list when a particularly new and really admirable idea occurred to him. Pnin and I had long since accepted the disturbing but seldom discussed fact that on any given college staff one could find not only a person who as uncommonly like one's dentist or other post or the local postmaster, but also a person who had a twin within the same professional group. I know indeed on a case of triplets at a comparatively small college where, according to its sharp-eyed president, Frank Reed, the radix of the troika was, absurdly enough, myself, and I recall the late Olga Krotky once telling me that among the 50 or so faculty members of a wartime intensive language school at which the poor one-lunged lady had to teach Lithuanian and Fenugreek, there are as many as 6 Pnins, besides the genuine and, to me, unique article. It should not be deemed surprising, therefore, that even Pnin, not a very observant man in everyday life, could not help becoming aware sometime during his 9th year at Wendell that a lanky, bespectacled old fellow with scholarly strands of steel-gray hair falling over the right side of his small but corrugated brow, and with a deep furrow descending from each side of his sharp nose to each corner of his long upper lip, a person whom Pnin knew as Professor Thomas Wynne, head of the ornithology department, having once talked to him at some party about gay golden orioles, melancholy cuckoos, and other Russian countryside birds, was not always Professor Wynne. At times he graded, as it were, into somebody else, whom Pnin did not know by name, but whom he classified, with a bright foreigner's fondness for puns, as twin, or in Pninian, twin. My friend and compatriot soon realized that he could never be sure whether the owlish, rapidly stalking gentleman, whose path he would cross every other day at different points of progress between his office and classroom, between classroom and stairs, between drinking fountain and lavatory, was really his chance acquaintance, the ornithologist whom he felt bound to greet in passing, or the wind-like stranger who acknowledged that somber salute with exactly the same degree of automatic politeness as any chance acquaintance would. The moment of meeting would be very brief, since both Pnin and Wynne, or twin, walked fast, and sometimes Pnin, in order to avoid the exchange of urbane barks, would feign reading a letter on the run, or would manage to dodge his rapidly advancing colleague and tormentor by swerving into a stairway and then continuing along a lower floor corridor. But no sooner had he begun to rejoice in the smartness of the device than, upon using it one day, he almost collided with Twin, or Vin, pounding along the subjacent passage. When the new fall term, Pnin's 10th, began, the nuisance was aggravated by the fact that Pnin's class hours had been changed, thus abolishing certain trends on which he had been learning to rely in efforts to elude Wynne and Wynne's simulator. It seemed he would have to endure it always. For recalling certain other duplications in the past, disconcerting likenesses he alone had seen, bothered Pnin told himself it would be useless to ask anybody's assistance in unraveling the tea winds. On the day of his party, as he was finishing a late lunch in Freeze Hall, Wynne or his double, neither of whom had ever appeared there before, suddenly sat down beside him and said, "I have long wanted to ask you something. You teach Russian, don't you? Last summer I was reading a magazine article on birds." "Vin! This Vin!" said Pnin to himself, and forthwith perceived a decisive course of action. "Well, the author of that article, I don't remember his name, I think it was a Russian one, mentioned that in the Pskov region, I hope I pronounce it right, a local cake is baked in the form of a bird. Basically, of course, the symbol is phallic, but I was wondering if you knew of such a custom?" It was then that the brilliant idea flashed in Pnin's mind. "Sir, I am at your service," he said, with a note of exultation quivering in his throat, for he now saw his way to pin down definitely the personality of at least the initial Wynne who liked birds. "Yes, sir, I know all about those Javoronsky, those alouettes, those—" we must consult a dictionary for the English names, so I take the opportunity to extend a cordial invitation to you to visit me this evening, 8:30 post-meridian, a little house-heating soiree, nothing more. Bring also your spouse, or perhaps you are a bachelor of hearts?" "Oh, Mr. Pnin." His interlocutor said he was not married. He would love to come. What was the address? "It is 999 Todd Road, very simple, at the very, very end of the road, where it unites with Cleef Avenue, a little brick house and a big black cliff." That afternoon, Pnin could hardly wait to start culinary operations. He began them soon after 5 and only interrupted them to don, for the reception of his guests, a sybaritic smoking jacket of blue silk with tasseled belt and satin lapels, won at an émigré charity bazaar in Paris 20 years ago. How time flies! The jacket he wore with a pair of old tuxedo trousers, likewise of European origin. Peering at himself in the cracked mirror of the medicine chest, he put on his heavy tortoiseshell reading glasses, from under the saddle of which his Russian potato nose smoothly bulged. He bared his synthetic teeth. He inspected his cheeks and chin to see if his morning shave still held. It did. With finger and thumb he grasped a long nostril hair, plucked it out after a second hard tug, and sneezed lustily. An ah of well-being rounded out the explosion. At 7:30, Betty arrived to help with the final arrangements. Betty now taught English and history at Isola High School. She had not changed since the days when she was a buxom graduate student. Her pink-rimmed, myopic gray eyes peered at you with the same ingenious sympathy. She wore the same Gretchen-like coil of thick hair around her head. There was the same scar on her soft throat, but an engagement ring with a diminutive diamond had appeared on her plump hand, and this she displayed with coy pride to Pnin, who vaguely experienced a twinge of sadness. He reflected that there was a time he might have courted her, would have done so, in fact, had she not set a servant-maid's mind, which had remained unaltered too. She could still relate a long story on a she said, I said, she said basis. Nothing on earth could make her disbelieve in the wisdom and wit of her favorite woman's magazine. She still had the curious trick, shared by 2 or 3 other small-town young women within Pnin's limited ken, of giving you a delayed little tap on the sleeve in acknowledgment of, rather than in retaliation for, any remark reminding her of some minor lapse. You would say, "Betty, you forgot to return that book," or, "I thought, Betty, you said you would never hurry, so you would never marry." And before she actually answered, there it would come, that demure gesture, retracted at the very moment her stubby fingers came into contact with your wrist. "He is a biochemist and now in Pittsburgh," said Betty, as she helped Pnin to arrange buttered slices of French bread around a pot of glossy gray fresh caviar, and to rinse 3 large bunches of grapes. There was also a large plate of cold cuts, real German pumpernickel, and a dish of very special vinaigrette, where shrimps hobnobbed with pickles and peas, and some miniature sausages and tomato sauce, and hot pierogi, mushroom tarts, meat tarts, cabbage tarts, and 4 kinds of nuts, and various interesting oriental sweets. Drinks were to be represented by whiskey, Betty's contribution, Ryabanovka, a rowan berry liquor, brandy and grenadine cocktails, and of course Pnin's punch, a heady mixture of chilled Chateau yquem, grapefruit juice, and maraschino, which the solemn host had already started to stir in a large bowl of brilliant aquamarine glass with a decorative design of swirled ribbling and lily pads. "My, what a lovely thing!" cried Betty. Pnin eyed the bowl with pleased surprise as if seeing it for the first time. "It was," he said, "a present from Victor." "Yes, how was he? How did he like St. Bart's?" "He liked it so-so. He had passed the beginning of the summer in California with his mother, and had worked 2 months at a Yosemite hotel." "A what?" "A hotel in the Californian mountains." Well, he had returned to his school and had suddenly sent this. By some tender coincidence, the bowl had come on the very day Pnin had counted the cherries and started to plan this party. It had come enclosed in a box within another box inside a third one, and wrapped up in an extravagant mass of excelsior and paper that had spread all over the kitchen like a carnival storm. The bowl that emerged was one of those gifts whose first impact produces in the recipient's mind a colored image, a blazoned blur reflecting with such emblematic force the sweet nature of the donor that the tangible attributes of the thing are dissolved, as it were, in this pure inner blaze that suddenly and forever leap into brilliant being when praised by an outsider to whom the true glory of the object is unknown. A musical tinkle reverberated through the small house, and the Clementses entered with a bottle of French champagne and a cluster of dahlias. Dark, blue-eyed, long-lashed, bob-haired Joan wore an old black silk dress that was smarter than anything other faculty wives could devise, and it was always a pleasure to watch good old bald Tim Pnin bend slightly to touch with his lips the light hand that Joan, alone of the Wayndale ladies, knew how to raise to exactly the right level for a Russian gentleman to kiss. Lawrence, fatter than ever, dressed in nice gray flannels, sank into the easy-chair, and immediately grabbed the first book at hand, which happened to be an English-Russian and Russian-English pocket dictionary. Holding his glasses in one hand, he looked away, trying to recall something he had always wished to check, but now could not remember, and his attitude accentuated his striking resemblance somewhat injured to Jan van Eyck's ample-jawed, fluff-haloed Canon van der Pale, seized by a fit of abstraction in the presence of the puzzled virgin to whom a super rigged up as St. George is directing the good Canon's attention. Everything was there, the naughty temple, the sad, musing gaze, the folds and furrows of facial flesh, the thin lips, and even the wart on the left cheek. Hardly had the Clementses settled down than Betty let in the man interested in bird-shaped cakes. Pnin was about to say, "Professor Vin," but Joan, rather unfortunately perhaps, interrupted the introduction with, "Oh, we know Thomas." "Who does not know Tom?" Tim Pnin returned in the kitchen, and Betty handed around some Bulgarian cigarettes. "I thought, Thomas," remarked Clements, crossing his fat legs, "you were out in Vienna, interviewing palm-climbing fishermen. Well, I'll be on my way after mid-years," said Professor Thomas. "Of course, most of the actual field work has been done already by others. Still, it was nice to get that grant, wasn't it?" "In our branch," replied Thomas with perfect composure, "we have to undertake many difficult journeys. In fact, I may push on to the Windward Islands if," he added with a hollow laugh, "Senator McCarthy does not crack down on foreign travel." "He received a grant of $10,000, said Joan to Betty, whose face dropped a curtsy as she made that special grimace consisting of a slow half-bow and tensing of chin and lower lip that automatically conveys, on the part of Betty's, a respectful, congratulatory, and slightly awed recognition of such grand things as dining with one's boss, being in Who's Who, or meeting a duchess. The Thyers, who came in a new station wagon, presented their host with an elegant box of mints. Dr. Hagen, who came on foot, triumphantly held aloft a bottle of vodka. "Good evening, good evening, good evening," said hearty Hagen. "Dr. Hagen," said Thomas as he shook hands with him, "I hope the senator did not see you walking about with that stuff." The good doctor had perceptibly aged since last year, but was as sturdy and square-shaped as ever, with his well-padded shoulders, square chin, square nostrils, leonine glabella, and rectangular brush of grizzled hair that had something topiary about it. He wore a black suit over a white nylon shirt, and a black tie with a red thunderbolt streaking down it. Miss Hagen had been prevented from coming at the very last moment by a dreadful nightmare, alas. Pnin served the cocktails, or better say flamingo tails, specially for ornithologists, as he slyly quipped. "Thank you," chanted Miss Thayer as she received her glass, raising her linear eyebrows on that bright note of genteel inquiry which is meant to combine the motions of surprise, unworthiness, and pleasure. An attractive, prim, pink-faced lady of 40 or so, with pearly dentures and wavy, golden-eyed hair, she was the provincial cousin of the smart, relaxed Joan Clements, who had been all over the world, even in Turkey and Egypt, and was married to the most original and least liked scholar in Wayndale campus. A good word should also be put in at this point for Margaret Thayer's husband, Roy, a mournful and mute member of the Department of English, which, except for its ebullient chairman, Cockerell, was an eyrie of hypochondriacs. Outwardly, Roy was an obvious figure. If you drew a pair of old brown loafers, 2 beige elbow patches, a black pipe, and 2 baggy eyes under heavy eyebrows, the rest was easy to fill out. Somewhere in the middle distance hung an obscure liver ailment, and somewhere in the background there was an 18th century poetry, Roy's particular field, an overgrazed pasture with the trickle of a brook and a clump of initialed trees. A barbed wire arrangement on either side of his field separated it from the Professor Stowe's domain. The preceding century, where the lambs were wider, the turf softer, the real pearlier, and from Shapiro's early 19th century with its glen mists, sea fogs, and imported grapes. Roy Thayer avoided talking of his subject, avoided, in fact, talking of any subject, had squandered a decade of grey life in an erudite work dealing with a foreign group of unnecessary poet-tasters, and kept a detailed diary in cryptographed verse, which he hoped posterity would some day decipher and a sober backcast proclaim the greatest literary achievement of our time. And for all I know, Roy Thayer, you may be right. When everybody was comfortably lapping and lauding the cocktails, Professor Pnin sat down on the wheezy hassock near his newest friend and said, "I have to report, sir, on the Skylark, Javoronok, in Russian, about which you made me the honor to interrogate me. Take this with you to your home. I have here tapped on a typewriting machine a condensed account with bibliography. I think we will now transport ourselves to the other room, where a supper a la fourchette is, I think, awaiting us." Presently guests with full plates drifted back into the parlor. The punch was brought in. "Gracious Timothy, where on earth did you get that perfectly divine bowl?" exclaimed Joan. "Victor presented it to me." "But where did he get it?" "Antiquaire store in Cranton, I think. Gosh, it must have cost a fortune." $1, $10, less maybe? $10, nonsense, 200, I should say. Look at it, look at this writhing pattern. You know, you should show it to the Cockerells. They know everything about old glass. In fact, they have a Lake Dunmore picture that looks like a poor relation of this. Margaret Thayer admired it in her turn, and said that when she was a child she imagined Cinderella's glass shoes to be exactly of that greenish-blue tint, whereupon Professor Pnin remarked that primo, he would like everybody to say if contents were as good as container, and secundo, that Cinderella's shoes were not made of glass but of Russian squirrel fur, ver in French. It was, he said, an obvious case of the survival of the fittest among words, ver being more evocative than ver, to which he submitted, came not from various, variegated, but from veverisca, Slavic for a certain beautiful pale winter squirrelish fur, having a bluish, or better say, sigilly columbine shade from columba, Latin for pigeon, as somebody here well knows. So you see, Miss Thayer, you were in general correct. "The contents are fine," said Lawrence Clements. "This beverage is certainly delicious," said Margaret Thayer. "I always thought columbine was some sort of flower," said Thomas to Betty, who lightly acquiesced. The respective ages of several children were then passed in review. Victor would be 15 soon. Eileen, the granddaughter of Miss Thayer's eldest sister, was 5. Isabel was 23 and greatly enjoying a secretarial job in New York. Dr. Hagen's daughter was 24 and about to return from Europe, where she had spent a wonderful summer touring Bavaria and Switzerland with a very gracious old lady, Doriana Karen, famous movie star of the 20s. The telephone rang. Somebody wanted to talk to Miss Shepherd. With a precision quite unusual for him in such matters, Unpredictable Pnin not only rattled off the woman's new address and telephone number, but also supplied those of her eldest son. By 10 o'clock, Pnin's punch and Betty's scotch were causing some of the guests to talk louder than they thought they did. A carmine flush had spread over one side of Miss Thyre's neck, under the little blue star of her left earring, and sitting very straight, she regaled her host with an account of the feud between two of her co-workers at the library. It was a simple office story, but her changes of tone from Miss Shrill to Mr. Basso, and the consciousness of the soiree going on so nicely, made Pnin bend his head and guffaw ecstatically behind his hand. Roy Thyre was weakly twinkling to himself as he looked into his punch down his gray porous nose and politely listened to Joan Clements, who, when she was a little high as she was now, had a fetching way of rapidly blinking or even completely closing her black-lashed blue eyes, and of interrupting her sentences to punctuated clause or gather a new momentum by deep hawing pants. But don't you think, Hall, that what he is trying to, practically in all his novels, is to express the fantastic recurrence of certain situations? Betty reminded her controlled little self, and expertly looked after the refreshments. In the bay end of the room, Clements kept morosely revolving the snow globe as Hagen, carefully avoiding the traditional intonations he would have used in more congenial surroundings, told him in grinning Thomas the latest story about Miss Idelson, communicated by Miss Blorange to Miss Hagen. Pnin came up with a plate of nougat. "This is not quite for your chaste ears, Timothy," said Hagen to Pnin, who always confessed he never could see the point of any scabrous antidote. However, Clements moved away to rejoin the ladies. Hagen began to retell the story, and Thomas began to re-grin. Pnin waved a hand at the raconteur in a Russian disgusted, "Oh, go on with you" gesture, and said, "I have heard quite the same anecdote 35 years ago in Odessa, and even then I could not understand what is comical in it." At a still later stage of the party, certain rearrangements had again taken place. In a corner of the Davenport board, Clements was flipping through the album of Flemish masterpieces that Victor had been given by his mother and had left with Pnin. Joan sat on a footstool at her husband's knee, a plate of grapes in the lap of her wide skirt. Wondering when it would be time to go without hurting Timothy's feelings. The others were listening to Hagen discussing modern education. "You may laugh," he said, casting a sharp glance at Clements, who shook his head, denying the charge, and then passed the album to Joan, pointing out something in that he had suddenly provoked his glee. "You may laugh, but I affirm that the only way to escape from the Morris, just a drop, Timothy, that will do, is to lock up the student in a soundproof cell and eliminate the lecture room." "Yes, that's it," said Joan to her husband under her breath, handing the album back to him. "I am glad you agree, Joan," continued Hagen. "However, I have been called an enfant terrible for expounding this theory, and perhaps you will not go on agreeing so easily when you hear me out. Phonograph records on every possible subject will be at the isolated student's disposal." "But the personality of the lecturer," said Margaret Thyre. "Surely that counts for something." "It does not," shouted Hagen. "That is the tragedy. Who, for example, wants him?" He pointed to radiant Pnin. "Who wants his personality?" "Nobody. They will reject Timothy's wonderful personality without a quaver. The world wants a machine, not a Timothy." "One could have Timothy televised," said Clements. "Oh, I would love that," said Joan, beaming at her host, and Betty nodded vigorously. Pnin bowed deeply to him, with an "I am disarmed" spreading of both hands. "And what do you think of my controversial plan?" asked Hagen of Thomas. "I can tell you what Tom thinks," said Clements, still contemplating the same picture in the book that lay open on his knees. "Tom thinks that the best method of teaching anything is to rely on discussion in class, which means letting 20 young blockheads and 2 cocky neurotics discuss for 50 minutes or something that neither the teacher nor they know. Now, for the last 3 months," he went on, without any logical transition, "I have been looking for this picture, and here it is. The publisher of my new book on the philosophy of gesture wants a portrait of me. Joan and I knew we had seen somewhere a stunning likeness by an old master, but could not even recall his period. Well, here it is, here it is. The only retouching needed would be the addition of a sports shirt and the deletion of this warrior's hand. I must really protest, began Thomas. Clemens passed the open book to Margaret Thayer, and she burst out laughing. I must protest, Lawrence, said Tom. A relaxed discussion in an atmosphere of broad generalizations is a more realistic approach to education than the old-fashioned formal lecture. Sure, sure, said Clemens. Joan scrambled up to her feet and covered her glass with her narrow palm when Pnin offered to replenish it. Miss Thayer looked at her wristwatch and then at her husband. A soft yawn distended Lawrence's mouth. Betty asked Thomas if he knew a man called Fogelman, an expert in bats who lived in Santa Clara, Cuba. Hagen asked for a glass of water or beer. Whom does he remind me of? Thought Pnin suddenly. Eric Wind? Why? They are quite different physically. The setting of a final scene was in the hallway. Hagen could not find the cane he had come with. It had fallen behind a trunk in the closet. And I think I left my purse where I was sitting, said Miss Thayer, pushing her pensive husband ever so slightly toward the living room. Pnin and Clemens, in last-minute discourse, stood on either side of the living room doorway, like two well-fed caryatides, and drew in their abdomens to let the silent Thayer pass. In the middle of the room, Professor Thomas and Miss Bliss, he with his hands behind his back and rising up every now and then on his toes, she holding a tray, were standing and talking of Cuba, where a cousin of Betty's fiancé had lived for quite a while, Betty understood. Thayer blundered from chair to chair and found himself with a white bag, not knowing really where he had picked it up, his mind being occupied by the adumbrations of lines he was to write down later in the night. We sat and drank each with a separate past, locked up in him, and fate's alarm clock set at unrelated futures. When at last a wrist was cocked and eyes of consorts met, meanwhile Pnin asked Joan Clemens and Margaret Thayer if they would care to see how he had embellished the upstairs rooms. The idea enchanted them. He led the way. His so-called cabinet now looked very cozy, its scratched floor smugly covered with the more or less Pakistan rug which he had once acquired for his office and recently removed in drastic silence from under the feet of surprised Falternfels. A tartan laprobe under which Pnin had crossed the ocean from Europe in 1940, and some endemic cushions disguised the unremovable bed. The pink shelves which he had found supporting several generations of children's books, from Ton the Bootblack, or The Road to Success by Horatio Alger, Jr., 1889, through Rolfe in the Woods by Ernest Thompson Seton in 1911, to a 1928 edition of Compton's Pictured Encyclopedia in 10 volumes with foggy little photographs, were now loaded with 365 items from the Waynedale College Library. And to think I have stamped all these, sighed Miss Thayer, rolling her eyes in mock dismay. Some stamped Miss Miller, said Pnin, a stickler for historical truth. What struck the visitors most in the bedroom was a large folding screen that cut off the four-poster bed from insidious draughts, and the view from the row of small windows, a dark rock wall rising abruptly some 50 feet away, with a stretch of pale starry sky above the black growth of its crest. On the black lawn, across the reflection of a window, Lawrence strolled into the shadows. At last you are really comfortable, said Joan. And you know that I will say to you, replied Pnin, in a confidential undertone vibrating with triumph, tomorrow morning, under the curtain of mystery, I will see a gentleman who is wanting to help me buy this house. They came down again. Roy handed his wife Betty's bag. Herman found his cane. Margaret's bag was sought. Lawrence reappeared. Goodbye, goodbye, Professor Vin, sang out Pnin, his cheeks ruddy and round with the lamplight of the porch. Still in the hallway, Betty and Margaret Thayer admired proud Dr. Hagen's walking stick, recently sent him from Germany, a gnarled cudgel with a donkey's head for a knob. The head could move one ear. The cane had once belonged to Dr. Hagen's Bavarian grandfather, a county clergyman. The mechanism of the other ear had broken down in 1914, according to a note the pastor left. Hagen carried it, he said, in defense against a certain Alsatian in Greenlawn Lane. American dogs were not used to pedestrians. He always preferred walking to driving. The ear could not be repaired, at least in Waynedale. Now I wonder why he called me that, said T.W. Thomas, professor of anthropology, to Lawrence and Joan Clements, as they walked through the blue darkness toward 4 cars parked under the elms on the other side of the road. Our friend, answered Clements, employs a nomenclature all his own. His verbal vagaries add a new thrill to life. His mispronunciations are mythopic. His slips of the tongue are oracular. He calls my wife John. Still, I find it a little disturbing, said Thomas. He probably mistook you for somebody else, said Clements, and for all I know, you may be somebody else. Before they had crossed the street, they were overtaken by Dr. Hagen. Professor Thomas, still looking puzzled, took his leave. Well, said Hagen. It was a fair fall night, velvet below, steel above. Joan asked, You're sure you don't want us to give you a lift? It's a 10-minute walk, and a walk is a must on such a wonderful night. The 3 of them stood for a moment, gazing at the stars. And all these are worlds, said Hagen. Or else, said Clements with a yawn, a frightful mess. I suspect it is really a fluorescent corpse, and we are inside it. From the lighted porch came Pnin's rich laughter as he finished recounting to the Thyers and Betty Bliss how he too had once retrieved the wrong reticule. Come, my fluorescent corpse, let's be moving, said Joan. It was so nice to see you, Herman. Give my love to Ermengarde. What a delightful party. I have never seen Timothy so happy. Yes, thank you, answered Hagen absent-mindedly. You should have seen his face, said Joan, when he told us he was going to talk to real estate man tomorrow about buying that dream house. He did? You're sure he said that? Hagen asked sharply. Quite sure, said Joan, and if anybody needs a house, it is certainly Timothy. Well, good night, said Hagen. Glad you could come. Good night. He waited for them to reach their car, hesitated, and then marched back to the lighted porch, where, standing as on a stage, Pnin was shaking hands a 2nd or 3rd time with the Thyers and Betty. I would never, said Joan, as she backed the car and worked on the wheel, but never have allowed my child to go abroad with that old lesbian. Careful, said Lawrence. He may be drunk, but he is not out of earshot. I shall not forgive you, said Betty to her merry host, for not letting me do the dishes. I'll help him, said Hagen, ascending to the porch steps and thumping upon them with his cane. You children run along now. There was a final round of handshakes as the Thyers and Betty left. First, said Hagen as he and Pnin re-entered the living room. I guess I'll have a last cup of wine with you. Perfect, perfect, cried Pnin. Let us finish my cruchon. They made themselves comfortable, and Dr. Hagen said, You are a wonderful host, Timothy. This is a very delightful moment. My grandfather used to say that a glass of good wine should be always sipped and savored as if it were the last one before the execution. I wonder what you put into this punch. I also wonder if, as our charming Joan affirms, you are really contemplating buying this house. Not contemplating, peeping at little possibilities, replied Pnin with a gurgling laugh. I question the wisdom of it, continued Hagen, nursing his goblet. Naturally, I am expecting that I will get tenure at last, said Pnin rather slyly. I am now assistant professor 9 years. Years run. Soon I will be assistant emeritus. Hagen, why are you silent? You place me in a very embarrassing position, Timothy. I hoped you would not raise this particular question. I do not raise the question. I say that I only expect, not next year, but example given 100th anniversary of liberation of serfs, Wendell will make me associate. Well, you see, my dear friend, I must tell you a sad secret. It is not official yet, and you must promise not to mention it to anyone. I swear, said Pnin, raising his hand. You cannot but know, continued with Hagen, with what loving care I built our great department. I too am no longer young. You say, Timothy, you have been here for 9 years, but I have been giving my all for 29 years to this university, my modest all, and my friend Dr. Kraft wrote me the other day, you, Herman Hagen, have done alone more for Germany and America than all our missions have done in Germany for America. And what happens now? I have nursed this Falternfels, this dragon, in my bosom, and he has now worked himself into a key position. I spare you the details of the intrigue." "Yes," said Pnin with a sigh, "intrigue is horrible, horrible. But on the other side, honest work will always prove its advantage. You and I will give next year some splendid new courses which I have planned long ago. Oh, tyranny, on the boot, on Nicholas on the First, on all the precursors of modern atrocity. Hagen, when we speak of injustice, we forget Armenian massacres, tortures which Tibet invented, colonists in Africa. The history of man is a history of pain." Hagen bent over to his friend and patted him on his knobby knee. "You are a wonderful romantic, Timothy, and under happier circumstances. However, I can tell you that in the spring term we are going to do something unusual." "We are going to stage a dramatic program. Scenes from Kotzebue to Hauptmann. I see it as a sort of apotheosis. But let us not anticipate. I too am a romantic, Timothy, and therefore cannot work with people like Bodo, as our trustees wish me to do. Kraft is retiring at Seaboard, and it has been offered to me that I replace him beginning next fall." "I congratulate you," said Pnin warmly. "Thanks, my friend. It is certainly a very fine and prominent position. I shall apply to a wider field of scholarship and administration the invaluable experience I have gained here. Of course, since I know Bodo will not continue you in the German department, my first move was to suggest you come with me, but they tell me they have enough Slavists and sea-bound without you. So I spoke to Blorenge, but the French department here is also full up. This is unfortunate, because Wendell feels it would be too much of a financial burden to pay you for 2 or 3 Russian courses that have ceased to attract students. Political trends in America, as we all know, discourage interest in things Russian. On the other hand, you will be glad to know that the English department is inviting one of your most brilliant compatriots, a really fascinating lecturer. I have heard him once. I think he's an old friend of yours." Pnin cleared his throat and asked, "It signifies that they are firing me? Now don't take it too hard, Timothy. I'm sure your old friend—" "Who is old friend?" queried Pnin, slitting his eyes. Hagen named the fascinating lecturer. Leaning forward, his elbows propped on his knees, clasping and unclasping his hands, Pnin said, "Yes, I know him 30 years or more. We are friends, but there is one thing perfectly certain. I will never work under him." "Well, I guess you should sleep it on it. Perhaps some solution may be found. Anyway, we'll have ample opportunity to discuss these matters. We shall go on teaching, you and I, as if nothing had happened, nicht wahr? We must be brave, Timothy." "So they have fired me," said Pnin, clasping his hands and nodding his head. "Yes, we are in the same boat, said jovial Hagen, and he stood up. It was getting very late. "I go now," said Hagen, who, though a lesser addict of the present tense than Pnin, also held it in favor. "It has been a wonderful party, and I would never have allowed myself to spoil the merriment of our mutual friend had not informed me of your optimistic intentions. Good night. Oh, by the way, naturally you will get your salary for the fall term in full, and then we shall see how much we can obtain for you in the spring term, especially if you will agree to take off some stupid office work from my poor old shoulders. And also, if you will participate vitally in the dramatic program in Newhall, I think you should actually play in it, under my daughter's direction. It would distract you from sad thoughts. Now go to bed at once, and put yourself to sleep with a good mystery story." On the porch, he pumped Pnin's unresponsive hand with enough vigor for 2. Then he flourished his cane and merrily marched down the wooden steps. The screen door banged behind him. "Der arm Kerl," muttered kind-hearted Hagen to himself as he walked homeward. "At least I have sweetened the pill." From a sideboard and dining-room table, Pnin removed the kitchen sink, the used china and silverware. He put away what food remained in the bright Arctic light of the refrigerator. The ham and tongue had all gone, and so had the little sausages. But the vinaigrette had not been a success, and enough caviar and meat tarts were left over for a meal of 2 tomorrow. "Boom, boom, boom," said the china closet as he passed by. He surveyed the living room and started to tidy it up. A last drop of Pnin's punch glistened in its beautiful bowl. Joan had crooked a lipstick-stained cigarette butt in her saucer. Betty had left no trace and had taken all the glasses back to the kitchen. Miss Thayer had forgotten a booklet of pretty multicolored matches on her plate, next to a bit of nougat. Mr. Thayer had twisted into all kinds of weird shapes half a dozen paper napkins. Hagen had quenched a messy cigar in an unbeaten bunchlet of grapes. In the kitchen, Pnin prepared to wash up the dishes. He removed his silk coat, his tie, and his dentures. To protect his shirt from a tuxedo trousers, he donned a soubrette-stappled apron. He scraped various tidbits off the plates into a brown paper bag to be given eventually to a mangy little white dog with pink patches on its back that visited him sometimes in the afternoon. There was no reason a human's misfortune should interfere with a canine's pleasure. He prepared a bubble bath in the sink for the crockery, the glass, the silverware, and with infinite care lowered the aquamarine bowl into the tepid foam. Its resonant flint glass emitted a sound full of muffled mellowness as it settled down to soak. He rinsed the amber goblets and silverware under the tap, and submerged them in the same foam. Then he fished out the knives, forks, spoons, rinsed them, and began to wipe them. He worked very slowly with a certain vagueness of manner that might have been taken for a mist of abstraction. In a less methodical man, he gathered the white spoons into a posy, placed them in a pitcher which he had washed out but not dried, and then took them out one by one and wiped them all over again. He groped under the bubbles around the goblets and under the melodious bowl for any piece of forgotten silver and retrieved a nutcracker. Fastidious Pnin rinsed it and was wiping it, when the leggy thing somehow slipped out of the towel and fell like a man from the roof. He almost caught it. His fingertips actually came into contact with it mid-air. But this only helped to propel it into the treasure-concealing foam in the sink, where an excruciating crack of broken glass followed upon the plunge. Pnin hurled the towel into a corner and, turning away, stood for a moment staring at the blackness beyond the threshold of the open black door. A quiet, lazy-winged little green insect circled the glare of a strong naked lamp above Pnin's glossy bald head. He looked very old with his toothless mouth half open and a film of tears dimming his blank, unblinking eyes. Then, with a moan of anguished anticipation, he went back to the sink and, bracing himself, dipped his hand deep into the foam. A jagger of glass stung him. Gently he removed a broken goblet. The beautiful bowl was intact. He took a fresh dish towel and went on with his household work. When everything was clean and dry, and the bowl stood aloof and serene on the safest shelf on a cupboard, and the little bright house was securely locked up in the large dark night, Pnin sat down at the kitchen table and, taking a sheet of yellow scrap paper from its drawer, unclipped his fountain pen and started to compose the draft of a letter. "Dear Hagen," he wrote in his clear, firm hand, "permit me to recapitulate the conversation we had taught tonight. It, I must confess, somewhat astonished me. If I had the honor to correctly understand you, you said..." Chapter 7. My first recollection of Timothy Pnin is connected with a speck of coal dust that entered my left eye on a spring Sunday in 1911. It was one of those rough, gusty, and lustrous mornings in St. Petersburg when the last transparent piece of Ladoga ice has been carried away to the Gulf by the Neva, and her indigo waves heave and lap the granite of the embankment, and the tugboats and huge barges, moored along the quay, creak and scrape rhythmically, and the mahogany brass of anchored steam yachts shine in the skittish sun. I have been trying out a beautiful new English bicycle given me for my 12th birthday, and as I rode home to our rosy stone house in Morskaya, over parquet smooth wooden pavements, the consciousness of having gravely disobeyed my tutor was less bothersome than the granule of smarting pain in the far north of my eyeball. Home remedies such as the application of wads of cotton wool soaked in cool tea and the trick Nosu rub nosewort device only made matters worse, and when I awoke next morning, the object lurking under my upper eyelid felt like a solid polygon that had become more deeply embedded at every watery link. In the afternoon, I was taken to a leading ophthalmologist, Dr. Pavel Pnin. One of those silly incidents that remain forever in a child's receptive mind marked the space-time of my tutor and I spent in the Dr. Pnin's sundust and plush waiting room, where the blue dab of a window in miniature was reflected in the glass dome of an ormulu clock on the mantelpiece, and two flies kept describing slow quadrangles around the lifeless chandelier. A lady wearing a plumed hat and her dark speckled husband were sitting on a connubial silence on the davenport. Then a cavalry officer entered and sat near the window reading a newspaper, and then the husband repaired to Dr. Pnin's study, and then I noticed an odd expression on my tutor's face. With my good eye I followed his stare. The officer was leaning toward the lady. In rapid French he berated her for something she had done or not done the day before. She gave him her gloved hand to kiss. He glued himself to its eyelet, and forthwith left, cured of whatever had ailed him. In softness of features, body bulk, leanness of leg, apish shape of ear and upper lip, Dr. Pavel Pnin looked very like Timothy, as the latter was to look 3 or 4 decades later. In the father, however, a fringe of straw-colored hair relieved a wax-like cavity. He wore a black-rimmed pince-nez on a black ribbon, like the late Dr. Shikov. He spoke in a gentle stutter, very unlike his son's later voice, and what a divine relief it was when, with a tiny instrument resembling an elf's drumstick, the tender doctor removed from my eyeball the offending black atom. I wonder where that speck is now. The dull, mad fact is that it does exist somewhere. Perhaps because on my visits to schoolmates I had seen other middle-class apartments, I unconsciously retained a picture of the Pnin flat that probably corresponds to reality. I can report, therefore, that as likely as not it consisted of 2 rows of rooms divided by a long corridor. On one side the reading room, the doctor's office, presumably a dining room and a drawing room further on, and on the other side were 2 or 3 bedrooms, a schoolroom, a bathroom, a maid's room, and a kitchen. I was about to leave with a phial of eye lotion. My tutor was taking the opportunity to ask Dr. Pnin if eye strain might cause gastric trouble, when the front door opened and shut. Dr. Pnin nimbly walked into the passage, voiced a query, received a quiet answer, and returned with his son Timothy, a 13-year-old gymnasist, a classical school pupil in his gymnasiesky uniform, black blouse, black pants, shiny black belt. I attended a more liberal school where we wore what we liked. Do I really remember his crew cut, his puffy, pale face, his red ears? Yes, distinctly. I even remember the way he imperceptibly removed his shoulder from under the proud paternal hand, while the proud paternal voice was saying, "This boy has just got a 5+, A+, in the algebra examination." From the end of the corridor there came a steady smell of hashed cabbage pie, and through the open door of the schoolroom I could see a map of Russia on the wall, books on a shelf, a stuffed squirrel, and a toy monoplane with linen wings and a rubber motor. I had a similar one, but twice bigger, bought in Biarritz. After one had wound up in the propeller for some time, the rubber would change its manner of twist and develop fascinating thick whorls which predicted the end of its tether. "5 years later, after spending the beginning of the summer on our estate near St. Petersburg, my mother, my young brother, and I happened to visit a dreary old aunt at her curiously desolate country seat, not far from a famous resort on the Baltic coast. One afternoon, as in a concentrated ecstasy, I was spreading, underside up, an exceptionally rare aberration of the Paphia fritillary, in which the silver stripes ornamenting the lower surface of its hind wings had fused into the even expanse of metallic gloss. A footman came up with the information that the old lady requested my presence. In the reception hall I found her talking to 2 self-conscious youths in university student uniforms, one with the blonde fuzz with Timothy Pnin. The other, with the russets down, was Grigory Bolochkin. They had come to ask my grand-aunt the permission to use an empty barn on the confines of her property for the staging of a play. This was a Russian translation of Arthur Schnitzler's 3-act Liebele. Ankorov, a provincial semi-professional actor, with a reputation consisting mainly of faded newspaper clippings was helping to rig up the thing. Would I participate? But at 16 I was as arrogant as I was shy and declined to play the anonymous gentleman in Act 1. The interview ended in mutual embarrassment, not alleviated by Pnin or Bolochkin overturning a glass of pear kvass, and I went back to my butterfly. A fortnight later I was somehow or other compelled to attend the performance. The barn was full of dachniki, vacationists, and disabled soldiers from a nearby hospital. I came with my brother, and next to me sat the steward of my aunt's estate, Robert Karlovich Horn, a cheerful, plump person from Riga with bloodshot, porcelain blue eyes, who kept applauding heartily at the wrong moments. I remember the odor of decorative fir branches and the eyes of peasant children glistening through the chinks in the walls. The front seats were so close to the stage that when the betrayed husband produced a packet of love letters written to his wife by Fritz Laubenheimer, dragoon and college student, and flung them to Fritz's face, you could see perfectly well that they were old postcards with the stamp corners cut off. I am perfectly sure that the small role of this irate gentleman was taken by Timothy Pnin, though of course he might also have appeared as somebody else in the following acts, but a buff overcoat, bushy mustachios, and a dark wig with a median parting disguised him so thoroughly that the minuscule interest I took in his existence might not have warranted any conscious assurance on my part. Fritz, the young lover doomed to die in a duel, not only has that mysterious affair backstage with the lady in black velvet, the gentleman's wife, but toys with the heart of Christine, a naive Viennese maiden. Fritz was played by stocky 40-year-old Ancherov, who wore a warm taupe makeup, thumped his chest with the sound of a rug beating, and by his impromptu contributions to the role he had not deigned to learn about paralyzed Fritz's pal, Theodore Kaiser, Grigory Bolochkin, a moneyed old maid in real life whom Ancherov humored, was miscast as Christine Wearing, the violinist's daughter. The role of the little milliner, Theodore's amoretta, Missy Schlegel, was charmingly acted by a pretty, slender-necked, velvet-eyed girl, Bolochkin's sister, who got the greatest ovation of the night.